The ring had been burning a hole in Colt Reardon's shirt pocket for 23 days, and on the morning of the 24th, he stood in front of the cracked mirror nailed to the wall of his bunkhouse and rehearsed the whole speech one more time, his hat pressed against his chest and his jaw set with the kind of determination that usually preceded a cattle drive. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Rehearsing, Texas sat baked under a sun that showed no mercy to anything growing beneath it. Not the scrubgrass along the creek, not the 3 sorry cottonwood trees behind the livery stable, and certainly not a lanky, dark-haired cowboy who had fallen so thoroughly, so completely, and so helplessly in love with a woman that he could barely rope a steer without thinking about her. Her name was Clara Voss. She had arrived in Rehearsing the previous September aboard the eastbound stage, which was notable because most people arrived from the east and left going west, not the other way around. Clara had come from a small town in Kansas called Millhaven, where she had spent 3 years running the general store for her ailing uncle after the death of her parents. When her uncle finally passed in August of 1877, he had left her the store, but also left her a debt she could not in good conscience keep. And so she had sold everything, paid what was owed, and climbed onto a stage heading south with a single trunk and a composition book she wrote in every evening before sleeping. She had taken up residence in the 2 rooms above the post office, which Mr. Harlan Briggs rented out for $3 a month, and within 2 weeks of her arrival she had secured work as the bookkeeper for Rehearsing's only physician, a stout, kind-faced man named Dr. Emmett Pearl, who had been keeping his records in a cigar box in a state of philosophical disaster. Colt had first laid eyes on her on a Tuesday afternoon when his horse threw a shoe near the edge of town, and he had walked the animal past the post office and seen a woman in a gray dress kneeling in the small garden plot beside the building's front steps, coaxing something green out of the orange dirt with a kind of patient insistence that had stopped him dead in his tracks. She had looked up at the sound of his horse's uneven gait, pushed a strand of light brown hair away from her face with the back of her wrist, and said, without preamble or particular concern for his feelings on the matter, "That horse needs a farrier. There's one 2 streets over. His name is Marcus Webb, and he is very good but very slow, so you had better get there before noon if you want the animal shod before sundown." Colt had stood there with his hat in his hand before he even realized he had taken it off. "Thank you, ma'am," he had said, and she had nodded once and returned to her gardening, and that had been the end of the conversation and the beginning of everything else. He had found Marcus Webb and gotten his horse reshod, and on the way back he had slowed deliberately as he passed the post office, but she was no longer in the garden. He had ridden back to the Alderman Ranch, where he worked as a hand along with 7 other men, and he had thought about her so persistently through supper that his bunkmate, a wiry old cowboy named Denny Sparks who had seen everything twice and forgotten none of it, had finally pointed a fork at him across the table and said, "You going to eat that corn bread or just stare at it until it talks back?" Colt had eaten his corn bread and said nothing, but Denny had grinned at him with an expression of complete and knowing amusement. The following Saturday, Colt had ridden into Rehearsing under the pretense of needing a new length of rope from the dry goods store. He had gotten the rope eventually, but he had also somehow found himself at the door of Dr. Pearl's office at a time he knew from casual conversation in the saloon that the doctor received no patients, which meant the only person inside would be the bookkeeper. Clara had answered the door, looked at him without any particular surprise, and said, "Are you ill or are you looking for something?" "Neither, I suppose," he had said, which was honest and also deeply embarrassing, and for a moment they had simply looked at each other through the open door. "Then you had better come in and have some water," she had said. "It is extremely hot today." That was how it had started, not with flowers or poetry or any of the grand gestures Colt had occasionally read about in the dime novels that circulated among the ranch hands. It had started with a glass of water in a doctor's office, and the 2 of them sitting in Dr. Pearl's reception, chairs talking for an hour and a half about things that mattered and things that did not, until Clara had looked at the clock on the wall and announced that she needed to finish the accounts for the week. He had come back the following Saturday, and the one after that, and after the fourth Saturday visit had stretched past the dinner hour and Clara had fed him leftover beans and bread at the small table in her rooms above the post office, Denny Sparks had shaken his head at Colt in the bunkhouse that night and said, "Son, you are gone. You are as gone as last year's rain. I have seen men fall before and none of them fell as hard and as fast as you are falling right now." Colt had not argued because there was nothing to argue. He was gone. He knew it. Through the autumn they had built something careful and real together. He visited every Saturday and most Sunday afternoons. He helped her haul water from the town well when the post office pump was frozen, and she brought him a jar of plum preserves she had somehow managed to put up with fruit from the Harmon widow's orchard. He told her about growing up in Central Texas, about his father who had worked cattle all his life and died of a fever when Colt was 15, about his mother who lived now in Abilene and sewed quilts and worried. She told him about Millhaven, about the general store and her uncle, about how she had always wanted a garden large enough to get genuinely lost in, and how she had written in her composition book every night since she was 12 years old. "What do you write about?" he had asked one evening in November, when the first real cold had come, and they were sitting on the narrow bench outside her door wrapped in separate blankets, watching the stars come out over the flat dark land. She had thought about it for a moment, the way she always thought before she spoke, never in a hurry to fill silence that did not need filling. "Observations," she had said finally. "Things I notice that I do not want to forget. The way light falls on certain things. The way people behave when they think nobody is watching." "Do you write about me?" he had asked, and he had not meant to say it out loud, but there it was. She had turned to look at him with an expression he could not quite read, somewhere between amusement and something much more serious. "Yes," she had said simply, and that one word had done more to him than a whole cathedral of poetry could have managed. December had come and with it the first hard cold, and Colt had found himself in a hardware store in the next town over, looking at a tray of rings with a studiousness usually reserved for the purchase of saddles or rifles. The proprietor had watched him with patient curiosity. "For a lady?" the man had asked. "Yes," Colt had said. "You want something that will last," the man had said, "but that will not look out of place on a working woman's hand. Something honest." Colt had chosen a gold band set with a small oval turquoise stone, the color of high country sky, and he had paid $7 for it and ridden back to Redrock with it wrapped in his handkerchief in his breast pocket, sitting very straight in the saddle as though the ring were something he might spill. But then Christmas had come and gone, and he had not proposed, and January had become February, and still the ring sat in his pocket. Not because he was afraid of her answer, exactly, though that was part of it. It was more that he wanted the words to be right. He wanted to say the thing the way it deserved to be said, to give the moment the weight it carried in his chest every single time he thought about her, which was always. So he had begun to practice. He practiced on his horse, a big gray gelding named August, while they moved cattle across the south pasture in the cold early morning light. He tried different openings, different arrangements of words, watching August's ears swivel as if the horse were considering each draft with genuine critical attention. He practiced in the bunkhouse when the other men were asleep, his voice barely above a whisper, the ring held between his thumb and forefinger and the lamplight catching the turquoise stone. He practiced on long night watches, leaning against a fence post with the stars spread out above him and the cattle settling in the dark, running through the speech until the words felt worn smooth as river rock from handling. Denny Sparks, who slept lightly and noticed everything, had found him at it one evening in the second week, and had sat down on the edge of his bunk with an expression of such profound and affectionate exasperation that Colt had stopped mid-sentence. "Just ask her," Denny said. "I want it to be right," Colt said. Reardon, Denny said, with the tone of a man who had been married twice and buried one wife and watched the second one leave and knew more about love than he had ever wanted to know. Nothing you can say to that woman is going to be wrong. She already knows what you feel. Women always know. What you are doing right now is practicing for an audience that does not need the performance. Just go and ask her. Colt had nodded, but he had kept practicing. By the end of the second week, he could recite the speech from memory in any order, forward or backward, half asleep or fully awake. He knew it in the morning quiet and in the afternoon heat. He knew it well enough that, when he lay on his bunk at night, the words came to him unbidden, rising up complete and polished, every word in its right place. He was going to tell her that she was the most genuinely surprising person he had ever met, that she had surprised him the very first moment he saw her and had not stopped since. He was going to tell her that he had spent most of his life on the move, on horses, on drives, across distances, and that she was the first thing that had made him want to stop and stay in one place and put down something permanent. He was going to tell her that he had a small amount of money saved, enough to buy a piece of land southeast of town that was selling at a reasonable price, and that he had been speaking to a man about cattle of his own, and that he wanted to build something real and lasting, and he wanted to build it with her. He was going to tell her that he had never been a man of particular eloquence, that words generally cost him something, but that there was one word he had become entirely certain of in the past 4 months, and that word was her name, and that everything he wanted and everything he hoped for was contained inside the sound of it. Then he was going to produce the ring. It was, he felt, a good speech. It was an honest speech. It said the true things. On the morning of the 24th day, he put on his cleanest shirt and his good hat and polished his boots with a rag until they reflected something close to sky, and he told Denny Sparks he would be back by supper or he would not be back at all, and Denny said, "About time," without looking up from the bridle he was mending. The ride into Rehearsing took 40 minutes at a steady pace, and for 39 of those minutes Colt was calm. He sat easy in the saddle, and the morning was beautiful in the particular way that West Texas mornings could be beautiful in early spring, all wide pale light and the smell of something living in the air that had not been there through the winter. His heartbeat was steady. His mind was clear. The words of the speech were there inside him, polished and ready. For the last minute of the ride, as August carried him around the final bend in the road, and the rooftops of Rehearsing came into view, his heart moved up somewhere into his throat and took up residence there. He tied August to the post outside the post office, straightened his hat, checked that the ring was in his pocket. It was always there, and climbed the narrow outer staircase that ran up the side of the building to the door of Clara's rooms. He stood on the small landing at the top of the stairs and looked at the door. He had stood on this landing many dozens of times in the past 7 months. He knew every board of it. He knew the way the railing wobbled on the left side. He knew the particular sound his knock made on this door and the exact length of time it took Clara to cross her rooms and open it. He raised his hand. He knocked. He heard her footsteps. He pulled in one breath and let it out slow and steady. And then the door opened. She was in a blue dress he had not seen before, the color of early evening, and her hair was partly pinned and partly loose in the way it sometimes was on Saturday mornings when she had not yet finished getting ready, and there was a small ink stain on her left wrist that meant she had been writing in her composition book. She was holding a coffee cup in her right hand. She looked at him with that expression she had, the one that was warm and attentive and slightly amused all at the same time, and she said, "Colt, good morning." And every single word of the speech left him, not gradually. Not the way you forget something and can still reach for it. All of it gone at once, as cleanly and completely as a candle flame in a wind. The first sentence, the middle part about stopping and staying, the bit about the land, the part about her name, the ring in his pocket that his hand had been moving toward, all of it simply vanished, and he stood there on the landing in his polished boots with his mouth open and absolutely nothing coming out. She waited. She was good at waiting. She tilted her head slightly, and her expression shifted from warm amusement toward something quieter and more serious. And she read him the way she always read things, carefully and completely. He was still not speaking. His mouth closed. He swallowed. His mouth opened again, nothing. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she set her coffee cup down on the small windowsill just inside the door, and she stepped out onto the landing and took his hand in both of hers, and she said very quietly, "Colt, I know." He looked at her. His voice, when it finally arrived, was entirely stripped of everything he had prepared, reduced down to the single most basic thing he had. "Clara," he said, "I have been trying to figure out how to say this for the better part of a month." "I know that too," she said, and there was nothing laughing in her voice. She was entirely serious and entirely steady. "I have a ring," he said. His hand found his pocket and drew it out, the small gold band with the turquoise stone, sitting in the center of his palm. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times in the past 23 days, and in not one of those imagined moments had he presented the ring like a man emptying his pockets in mild bewilderment. But here they were. She looked at the ring for a long time. Long enough that his heartbeat became the loudest thing in the world. "It is the color of sky," she said finally, very softly. "You once said you liked the sky here," he said. "Better than Kansas sky, more of it." She looked up at him. Her eyes were gray with a touch of green in them, and right now they were doing something complicated and true that he was not sure he could have described even with a month's practice. "Yes," she said. "Is that a yes to the ring?" he asked, because he needed to be sure, because he was not entirely confident his heart could survive an ambiguous answer. "Yes," she said again, and this time the word carried everything. And he slid the ring onto her finger, and she let out one small breath as if she had been holding it for a long time. And then he put his arms around her right there on that wobbling landing above the post office, and the whole town of Reedrock, and the whole of the spring morning, and the whole wide Texas sky. And she pressed her face against his shoulder, and he pressed his face against the top of her head, and they stood there for a long time not saying anything at all. Which was, it turned out, exactly the right thing to say. 3 weeks after the proposal on the landing, the practical business of their future began in earnest, and with a kind of cheerful urgency that Colt found both exhilarating and slightly overwhelming. The land he had mentioned in his speech, the speech that had ultimately been delivered in 4 words and a ring, was 112 acres southeast of Reedrock, belonging to a rancher named George Petty, who was moving his family north to Colorado. Colt had been watching the parcel for 6 months. It had a good creek, a stand of pecan trees along the eastern edge, and a small stone house that Petty had built in 1871 and which needed work but had good bones. The price was $800 for everything, including a barn and 3 outbuildings. Colt had $460 saved in the bank in Reedrock, the accumulation of years of wages and extreme reluctance to spend money on anything that could not be used on a ranch. He rode out to the Alderman property and spoke with his employer, a heavy-set, good-natured man named Gerald Alderman, who listened to the whole story with his thumbs in his belt and his eyes narrowed in thought. "I will tell you what," Alderman said. "You have worked for me 6 years and I have never had a better hand. I will loan you the remaining $340 at no interest, and you can pay me back in labor or in cattle or in cash money as you are able. I would rather have you 2 miles down the road than lose you to Colorado or California." Colt shook the man's hand and felt the particular warmth of a debt offered from genuine goodwill rather than obligation, which was a debt he intended to honor fully and quickly. The sale was completed inside of a fortnight, the papers signed in the office of Reedrock's single attorney, a young man named Tobias Church who had come out from Virginia 2 years prior, and still wore a coat that was too fine for West Texas weather, but who drew up a clean and legal document and charged a fair price for it. Clara walked every inch of the 112 acres on the first Sunday after the deed transferred, Colt beside her, pointing out the Good Creek and the pecan trees, and the particular rise of land on the western side from which you could see 30 miles of open country on a clear day. She took it all in with the quiet thoroughness she brought to everything, and when they reached the small stone house and pushed open the door on its stiff hinges and stood inside the main room looking at the cracked plaster and the stone fireplace and the low ceiling beams and the two small windows that let in thick blocks of afternoon light, she turned in a slow circle and then looked at him with an expression that made him want to build the whole world over again just to give it to her. "It has good light," she said. "It does," he said. "We will need to replaster the walls," she said, "and the floor is uneven in the corner there, and the windows should be larger." "Yes," he said, making a mental list. "The fireplace is beautiful," she said. "Someone built that with real care. Petty told me his father-in-law laid every stone," he said. She nodded, running her hand along the smooth stone. "Then it will hold," she said, and he understood she was talking about more than the fireplace. The wedding was planned for May the 15th, which gave them 6 weeks and was the target of considerable organizational energy from Clara, who approached the planning with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to Dr. Pearl's accounts. The ceremony would be held in the small white church at the edge of town, conducted by Reverend Morris, who was a lean, humorless man Monday through Saturday, but apparently transformed into something warmer on Sundays, or so people said. Dr. Pearl was delighted by the engagement in the particular way of people who have watched something develop from its earliest stages and feel personally invested in the outcome. He appeared at the post office 2 days after the proposal with a bottle of good whiskey and a solemn expression that cracked into a broad smile the moment Clara opened the door, and he pumped Colt's hand and said, "Young man, you have excellent taste, and I would like you to know that I am taking full credit for this, since I did hire her." "You hired her to keep your books," Clara said, with the dry warmth that characterized her humor, "which are still in considerable disorder, so I would focus less on taking credit and more on catching up with January." Dr. Pearl laughed until he had to sit down. Denny Sparks rode into town the following Saturday specifically to meet Clara, a visit he announced as necessary on the grounds that he had heard so much about the woman in question that he felt he had a right to form an opinion firsthand. He arrived with his hat in his hands and a slightly formal air that Clara dissolved within 5 minutes by offering him coffee and asking him a direct question about the most difficult cattle drive he had ever been on, which was, Colt later told her, precisely the right question to ask a man like Denny, who had spent 40 years accumulating stories and required only the smallest opening to share them. By the time Denny rode back to the ranch that evening, he had told Clara 6 stories, drunk 3 cups of coffee, and consumed a considerable portion of a dried apple cake she had made that morning. He pulled up alongside Colt outside the post office before mounting up and said with great seriousness, "She is the real article, Reardon. You had better be worthy of her." "I know," Colt said. "I mean it," Denny said. "I am not speaking lightly." "I know that too," Colt said. Denny gave him one long, assessing look, decided apparently that he would do, and rode off toward the ranch in the last of the day's light. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Colt rode out to the stone house every evening after his day's work was done and labored until the light was gone. He replastered the interior walls with help from a mason named Vicent Flores, who lived at the southern edge of Ridge Rock, and who did the work at a fair price, and with genuine skill, patching and smoothing until the walls were clean and even. He replaced 3 boards in the roof that had begun to give, bought new glass for the windows, and spent 2 full Sundays with a level and a bag of sand, bringing the interior floor as close to level as could be managed. Clara came out on Saturdays with tools and her own determined competence and worked alongside him, and they discovered in this process that they were well matched in the practical business of building and fixing things, that they had compatible ideas about where furniture should go and how a kitchen should be arranged, and that they could disagree about these things without rancor, and generally arrive at a reasonable conclusion, without either of them conceding anything they actually cared about. She also planted a kitchen garden in the cleared ground along the south wall of the house, working the orange dirt with a determination that Reedrock's soil had presumably never encountered before, mixing in the rotted leaves and manure until it was something a living thing might actually want to grow in. "What are you planting?" he asked, watching her work one Saturday morning in late April. "Beans," she said. "Squash. Tomatoes if the heat does not destroy them. Herbs." She sat back on her heels and looked at the prepared row. "And I want to try sunflowers along the fence line." "Sunflowers do not produce anything," he said, not critically, just noting it. She looked at him with a mildly patient expression. "They produce sunflowers," she said. "That produces joy, which produces everything else. Plant the sunflowers, Colt." He planted the sunflowers. Colt's mother, Clara Reardon, arrived from Abilene 3 days before the wedding, having traveled by stage with a trunk of her own, and a manner that was warm and slightly nervous, and absolutely determined to like Clara before she had even met her, which Colt recognized as the best possible disposition for a first meeting. Clara was 51, a small woman with strong hands and gray-streaked hair, and a directness of expression that made absolute sense once you had met her son. Clara met her at the stage and walked her to the rooms above the post office with a composure that Colt, watching from across the street, could only admire, because meeting a future mother-in-law with 3 days' notice in a town you had lived in for 8 months was not a small thing, and Clara managed it with the particular grace of someone who had decided in advance that it was going to be fine, and had allocated no energy for any other outcome. By supper time that evening, Clara and Clara were deep in a conversation about vegetable gardening that appeared to be of mutual and genuine interest, and Colt sat at the small table drinking coffee and feeling the profound peace of a man whose 2 most important people were getting along well. "Your mother is remarkable," Clara told him later when Clara had gone to bed at the Reedrock boarding house where she was staying. "She is," he said. "She also likes you very much. She told me when you were in the kitchen that you were obviously sensible and that she was relieved." "Relieved," Clara said with a lift of one eyebrow. "She had some concern that I might choose someone impractical," he said, "on account of the fact that when I was 17 I developed a very strong attachment to a girl in our county who believed that rain was caused by the feelings of clouds." Clara stared at him for a moment. "What does that even mean?" she said. "I was never entirely sure," he said, "but I was 17. Clara laughed, which was one of his absolute favorite things in the world, a real laugh that she gave only when something genuinely struck her, none of the polite social kind, just honest amusement. "I am glad you grew out of that," she said. "Your judgment improved significantly," Clara told him the following morning at breakfast, and he did not argue. The wedding was on a May morning that was already warm by 8 o'clock, the sky a blue that had no equal anywhere, and the small white church was full of Reedrock residents in their best clothes, which varied considerably in quality and formality, but were unified in the genuine pleasure their wearers took in the occasion. Dr. Pearl sat in the front row on the groom's side and looked enormously pleased with himself. Denny Sparks sat beside him and looked as if he might produce an emotion at any moment but was successfully managing it. Gerald Alderman and his wife had driven in from the ranch. Vicent Flores sat near the back with his wife and 3 children. Mr. Harlan Briggs, who had rented Clara her rooms for 8 months, sat in the middle rows with a handkerchief he occasionally applied to the corner of one eye. Clara came down the aisle on her own, because there was no father or brother to give her, and she had told Colt that this was fine, and that she was perfectly capable of walking herself down an aisle, and that the notion of being given by one man to another was not one she had ever found particularly compelling in any case. She wore a dress of cream-colored cotton with small embroidered flowers at the collar, and her hair was done up in a way that Clara had helped with that morning, and she walked with a straight back and a steady step, and her eyes went straight to Colt the moment she came through the church doors, and they did not leave him for the entire walk. He watched her come toward him and thought, clearly and simply, that this was the most important thing that had ever happened to him, and that he was going to take care to deserve it every day he was given. Reverend Morris did indeed transform on Sundays. He spoke about marriage with a plainness and warmth that was nothing like his weekday manner, about the work of it and the grace of it, and the way two people who chose each other truly, and honestly built something larger than either of them could alone. When the Reverend reached the vows, Colt held Clara's hands and looked at her and said every word with the full weight of everything he meant. And Clara said hers in her direct, quiet way that made each word sound like the conclusion of careful thought rather than a recitation, which of course it was. When he slid the ring onto her finger, the turquoise catching the light through the church window, he heard someone in the congregation make a small, soft sound. He was fairly sure it was Denny Sparks. The summer of 1878 was hot even by Texas standards, a heat that settled in by June and showed no signs of reconsidering its position through July or August. But on the 112 acres southeast of Ridge Rock, the pecan trees along the creek threw good shade, and the water ran cold and clear. And in the evenings, when the worst of the heat had backed off a degree or two cold, and Clara would sit on the bench he had built against the south wall of the stone house and listen to the land settling into night, Clara continued working for Dr. Pearl 3 mornings a week, because she had told Colt she intended to keep doing so, and he had said that seemed entirely reasonable. And the accounts were finally in order, and the doctor was growing increasingly dependent on the fact that he could find any record he needed inside of 2 minutes. With the other mornings, she tended the kitchen garden, which was producing with an enthusiasm that seemed to vindicate every argument she had made for amending the soil, and she wrote in her composition books. She had started a new one in May, and it was filling quickly. Colt worked the Alderman Ranch through the week, and on weekends worked his own land, building a proper fence around the 40 acres. He planned to stock, mending and improving the barn, working with a quiet and steady industry that he found deeply satisfying in a way that working someone else's land never quite had been. In the evenings they ate together and talked about the day's work and the garden and the neighbors and what they had read and what they were thinking about, and all the small particular things that accumulate into the texture of a shared life. They discovered new things about each other with a regularity that Colt found endlessly interesting, small surprises emerging from the ordinary process of inhabiting the same days. He learned that she woke at the slightest sound but could sleep through a thunderstorm. She learned that he could fix almost any mechanical thing, but was genuinely mystified by any machine with more than 4 moving parts. He learned that she had a strong and largely undeclared opinion about virtually every subject she encountered, and that getting her to share those opinions was a matter of asking the right question and then stepping back. She learned that he was funnier than he appeared, that his humor was dry and quiet and occasionally devastating, and that it emerged most completely when he was comfortable and safe. They were happy, genuinely, groundedly, daily happy, in the way that has nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with choosing the same direction. In August, a difficulty arose, as difficulties do, not dramatically but through a slow accumulation of small bad things. The south portion of their creek had begun to run lower than it should, even in a dry summer. The grass on the south pasture was going yellow ahead of schedule. Colt rode the fence line and found, one Saturday morning, that the creek upstream had been partially dammed. Not by nature. Someone had built a weir that was diverting most of the water onto the neighboring property to the north, which had recently changed hands. The new neighbor was a man named Harlan Mace, who had come down from Amarillo with money and ambition, and a crew of 4 hard-looking men, and who had bought the Caldwell property, 150 acres that shared the creek with Colt's 112. Mace had been in the area 2 months and had already been the subject of conversation in Reed Rock, none of it particularly warm. Colt rode to the Mace property and knocked at the door of the big frame house Mace had built there, a finer house than any surrounding it, which seemed to be the point. Mace answered himself, a heavy-set man in his mid-40s with a wide face and the flat, unhurried eyes of someone who expected to get whatever he wanted. He listened to Colt's account of the weir with an expression of polite vacancy, and then said, with an air of reasonable explanation, that the creek ran through his property too, and he needed the water for his stock, and that he figured there was plenty for everyone. "There is not," Colt said, keeping his voice even and his hands relaxed. "Plenty for everyone if the upstream neighbor takes the majority. I have a legal right to the water that flows through my land." "That may be," Mace said, in a tone that suggested legal rights were a matter of general interest but not immediate concern. "But that weir took my men 2 weeks to build, and I am not inclined to have it pulled out over a neighborly complaint." Colt looked at the man for a long moment. "This is not a complaint," he said. "This is a notice that I will be speaking with Tobias Church on Monday, and that what your men built is an unlawful interference with my water rights, and that if the weir is not removed, I will pursue every legal remedy available." He rode back home in a state of controlled fury and told Clara that evening. She listened without interruption, which she always did, then said, "And is Tobias Church actually capable of managing this?" "I believe so," Colt said. "He is young, but he knows the law." "Then that is the right approach," she said. "Do not damage the weir yourself. Let the law handle it." "And if the law is too slow," he said, she looked at him steadily, "then the law is too slow. But you are not going to make enemies of 4 hard men over a dam when there is a legal path. I would rather be 1 season short of water than have you come home bleeding." He understood that this was love speaking, practical and fierce, and not to be argued with. Tobias Church did, in fact, know the law on water rights, and what Mace had done was straightforwardly illegal under Texas statute. Church wrote a letter to Mace citing the relevant legal provision and stating his intention to file for an injunction if the weir was not removed within 10 days. The weir was not removed in 10 days. Church filed for the injunction in the district court, which involved a judge who traveled a circuit and came through Reed Rock every 6 weeks, ruled in Colt's favor inside of 3 months, which was, as legal proceedings went in West Texas in 1878, actually quite fast. The weir was ordered removed and Mace was assessed a fine. Mace was not gracious about it. He did not speak to Colt when they crossed paths in town, and his men were openly unfriendly. But he did nothing more active than that. And by October the creek was running properly again, and the autumn rains had settled the whole matter into the category of things survived and finished. "I told you," Clara said one evening after the court's ruling. "You did," Colt agreed. "Make a note," she said. "It is noted," he said. She smiled at him over the rim of her coffee cup, and the fire in the stone fireplace, which was everything it had promised to be, lit the room with a warm and steady light. In November, a letter arrived for Colt from his mother in Abilene. Eleanor had been in correspondence with them regularly since the wedding, letters arriving every 2 or 3 weeks with reports on the weather and the quilts and the neighbors and occasional small enclosed gifts, a recipe written in her careful hand, a packet of seeds from her own garden, a pressed flower she thought Clara might like. The letters were the kind that made a person feel accompanied even across a distance. This particular letter was different in tone. Eleanor's handwriting was less even than usual, and she told him directly, which was her way, that she had not been well. A persistent cough that had arrived in September and had not departed despite a doctor's attention. She said she was not alarmed and he should not be alarmed, but she wanted him to know. Colt read the letter twice and then sat still with it for a moment. "I need to go to Abilene," he said when Clara came in from the garden. She read the letter and was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "of course. I can be there and back in a week if I take the stage," he said. "Take the stage," she said. "I will manage here. Dr. Pearl can have someone else do the numbers if I need to be home instead." "I do not want to leave you with everything," he said. "Colt," she said, with a patience that was also a gentle rebuke, "your mother is not well. Go." He went. Clara Reardon was a more diminished version of the woman who had come to the wedding in May, which was a shock despite the letter's warning, because 6 months was not very long to watch someone grow smaller. But her eyes were the same, clear and direct and warm, and she received him with a strength that came from something deeper than the body's current report on itself. He stayed 5 days. He chopped wood and carried water and sat with her in the evenings while she sewed, and they talked with the easiness of two people who had never needed to perform for each other. She asked him many questions about Clara, which he answered with a thoroughness that made her smile. "You talk about her the way your father talked about me," she said one evening. "Not in a romantic way, though that too, but as though she is a person whose opinions and observations you actually respect and find interesting." "She is the most interesting person I have ever met," he said simply. Clara nodded, satisfied. "Good," she said. "That is the part that lasts." The doctor in Abilene told Colt privately that Clara had a condition of the lungs that was chronic but manageable, that she needed to avoid cold and damp, rest adequately, and take the medicine he had prescribed. She could live comfortably for many years with proper care. She should not live alone. Colt rode back to Reedrock on the stage with this information sitting heavy inside him, and spent most of the journey working through the only possible response. Clara was waiting for him when the stage came in, standing in the afternoon light with her shawl over her shoulders and the kind of steadiness she always had, which was a kind of home he had come to need. He told her what the doctor had said before they had even left the stage depot. She did not hesitate. "She should come here," she said. "That is a lot to ask," he said. "You are not asking," she said. "I am saying she should come here. We have room. The stone house has 3 rooms and we are using 2. He looked at her. "Clara," he said, "do not make it complicated," she said. "She is your mother and she is not well and she needs proper care, and there is no reason in the world she should stay alone in Abilene getting worse." She paused. "Unless she would be unwilling to come." "She would not be unwilling," he said. "She loves you." "Then write the letter tonight," Clara said, and took his arm and walked him home. Clara Reardon arrived in Reedrock the following March, 1879, with her trunk and her quilting things, and a general air of someone who had decided to find this new arrangement quite satisfactory, and intended to make good on that decision. She moved into the 3rd room of the stone house, which Clara and Colt had spent the winter making ready, fresh plaster, a proper bed, a south-facing window to catch the good light. Clara was, from the start, exactly what Colt had hoped and also more. She did not interfere. She did not offer opinions where they had not been requested. She contributed to the household in ways that were useful rather than imposing. She cooked several times a week with a skill that was considerably superior to either of theirs. She took charge of certain mending that Clara had been doing at the end of long days and had privately found exhausting, and she and Clara developed, without any particular fanfare or announcement, a friendship of genuine substance. Colt would sometimes come in from the barn in the early evenings and find them at the kitchen table, Clara with her composition book and Clara with her quilting, talking quietly about things he had not been part of, and the warmth of that particular picture settled in him like something permanent. By the spring of 1879, Colt had paid back half of what he owed Gerald Alderman, having sold a portion of his first cattle stock at a favorable price after a winter that had been dry enough that his southern pasture grass had held through February. He was working the Alderman ranch 4 days a week now rather than 6, and the other 3 days were his own land, and the balance was shifting gradually toward a point at which the 112 acres would sustain them without the hired work. On a Saturday morning in April, Clara sat at the kitchen table and did not get up as quickly as usual when Alina called that the coffee was ready. And when she did get up, she moved with a careful deliberateness that Colt recognized as the movement of someone managing a physical unease. He did not ask immediately, because he had learned that she preferred to arrive at things in her own time rather than being met at the gate. By Sunday evening, she told him. They were sitting on the south bench in the warm evening, the kitchen garden coming up green and ambitious, the sunflowers along the fence line beginning to show their first brave leaves, and she said, with the directness that was simply her nature, "I believe I am expecting." He was quiet for a moment, taking it in. Then he turned to look at her, and she was watching him with a calm expression that was also watchful, reading him as she always did. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Reasonably," she said. "I will see Dr. Pearl on Monday." He reached over and took her hand. He held it for a moment, feeling the gold band with the turquoise stone, the now familiar weight of it. "Are you well?" he asked. "Right now, this moment." "A bit queasy in the mornings," she said. "Otherwise fine." "Good," he said. And then, because it was true and needed saying, "Clara, I'm going to say something, and I need you to not look at me for a moment because I am not sure I can get it out if you do." She turned her gaze out to the fence line and the sunflower seedlings. "Go ahead," she said. "I did not know," he said slowly, "that anything could make me more certain that this is exactly where I am supposed to be and who I am supposed to be with. And I was wrong about that. This does." He paused. "You can look at me now." She turned, and the expression on her face was one he had never seen before, something open and overwhelmed and entirely unguarded, and she was not a woman who was generally unguarded, and he understood that it was the truest thing she had ever let him see. She did not say anything. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that as the sky went from orange to deep blue to the first dark of evening, and the pecan trees moved in the small wind off the creek. Dr. Pearl confirmed everything on Monday and was so pleased that he appeared to briefly lose his professional composure entirely, and then recovered it and spoke in clear and practical terms about what to expect, which Clara received with her characteristic attentiveness, and immediately began writing down in her composition book. Alina, when she was told, got up from her quilting and embraced Clara with a gentleness and a genuine joy that made Clara's eyes go bright in a way that she blinked away quickly because she was not generally given to crying. But she was, it turned out, rather more given to it these days than she had previously been, which was both new and somewhat inconvenient, and she bore it with patient self-awareness. The autumn of 1879 moved toward October with a warmth and fullness that Colt found it difficult to be inside of without a persistent sensation of disbelief at his own luck. The ranch was doing well. The cattle were healthy. The house was solid and warm and contained his mother and his wife and the daily business of their shared life, and Clara was large and deliberate with the pregnancy now, and still went to Dr. Pearl's 3 mornings a week, arriving home each time with the slightly victorious expression of someone who has accomplished what they intended to accomplish. "You could stop for a while," he said one evening, not critically, just offering it. "I could," she said. "But the accounts are interesting this month because he has taken on a new arrangement with the county for services, and I want to see it through to the reconciliation." "Of course you do," he said. "Do not say it like that," she said, but she was smiling. "Like what?" he said innocently. "Like you find it entirely predictable." "I find it entirely wonderful," he said, and she turned her face away with a small movement that he recognized as trying not to be obviously pleased. On the 14th of October, 1879, a son was born in the stone house southeast of Red Rock, Texas, delivered by Dr. Pearl, who had driven out in the early morning, and was present through a long and serious day that Colt spent largely in the barn trying to be useful and failing, existing in a state of suspended time that had no precedent in his experience. Denny Sparks appeared at the barn door at some point in the afternoon, having ridden over from the Alderman Ranch on information Colt could not account for, and sat down on a hay bale and did not say anything for a long while, which was a form of company Colt found exactly right. "It takes a long time," Colt said at one point. "It always does," Denny said. "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" Colt said. "It is supposed to be accurate," Denny said. "Doctor." Pearl came to the barn door as the last of the afternoon light was fading, and told Colt he could come in now. And Colt walked into the house on legs that were not entirely reliable, and into the bedroom where Clara was propped against pillows with her hair loose, and her face exhausted and luminous, and entirely the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. And in her arms was a small person who appeared to be considering the question of existence with the kind of deep concentrated frown that suggested serious early opinions. "He has your forehead," Clara said, her voice roughened with the day but warm and clear underneath. Colt sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was very small and very real, and felt the world shift on its axis in a way he suspected it would never fully shift back. "He is remarkable," he said. "He is," Clara agreed, with the complete satisfaction of someone who has accomplished a very significant piece of work. "What shall we call him?" Colt asked. They had discussed names for months without resolution, having strong opinions about certain letters and syllables but no overall agreement. Colt had suggested William, after his father. Clara had mentioned Arthur, which she liked for reasons she described as having to do with the sound. They had written a list. Now Clara looked at the child in her arms and then at Colt and said, James William Reardon." It had not been on the list. He considered it. "James William," he said. "That is a good name." "It sounds like someone who will be capable," she said. "James William Reardon," he said again, making it real. "Yes." From the kitchen they heard Eleanor making dinner with a quiet and purposeful industry, and through the window the October stars were beginning to appear over the West Texas darkness, and the stone fireplace was lit and warm, and James William Reardon, 8 pounds and deeply opinionated even in his first hours, slept against his mother's chest. Colt looked at Clara, at the particular way she held the baby, at the way her face had a quality of peace in it alongside the exhaustion, and he thought about a landing above a post office in the early spring with his heart in his throat and all his carefully prepared words gone. He thought about how sometimes the truest things could not be practiced. "Clara," he said. She looked at him, quietly waiting, the way she always did. "I still cannot say it the way it deserves," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, at the earnestness and the insufficient words and the full feeling behind them, and she said, "You never have to, I know." And she did. The year that followed was the hardest and the most rewarding of Colt's life, and the two did not cancel each other out, but existed together in the way that real things do, layered and simultaneous. James was a child of large appetites and decisive opinions even from his earliest weeks, Clara's directness in miniature. Colt thought with a private and amused pride. He slept badly for the first 3 months, and the stone house existed during those weeks in a gentle rotating exhaustion, everyone doing their portion of the night management without drama, Eleanor taking the earliest watch so that Clara could sleep, until 4 and Colt taking the last watch before the working day began. They did not keep score on these things. They simply moved around each other, and the baby's needs like parts of a machinery that had decided to work together. By spring James was sleeping through, and had begun to show an interest in everything within his field of vision, with the concentrated curiosity of a person who has recently arrived in a world that appears to be full of astonishing things, and intends to understand all of them. He reached for everything. He observed everything. He had Clara's eyes and Colt's dark hair, and what appeared to be entirely his own personality, specific and strong and enormously entertaining. Colt made his final payment to Gerald Alderman in April of 1880, 2.5 years after the man had lent him the money with no interest and considerable goodwill, and rode out to the ranch on a Saturday morning with the cash in an envelope and shook Alderman's hand and felt the clean particular satisfaction of a debt honored in full. "You going to be all right without the ranch work?" Alderman asked. He had been using Colt 3 days a week still, partly because Colt was genuinely valuable and partly, Colt suspected, out of a kind of benevolent reluctance to let go. "I believe so," Colt said. "The cattle are doing well. I have 60 head going into summer and the pasture is holding." Alderman nodded slowly. "If you ever need work or want it," he said, "you know where I am." "I do," Colt said, "and I am grateful not just for this." He held up the envelope briefly before Alderman took it. "For everything." Alderman tucked the envelope in his coat and looked at Colt with the expression of a man who does not generally say sentimental things but who is currently considering making an exception. He settled for putting one large hand briefly on Colt's shoulder. "Get home," he said gruffly. "Your wife is smarter than you are and you do not want to keep her waiting." Colt rode home. The summer of 1880 was easier than the summer of 1878, perhaps because the water situation was fully resolved. Mace had sold his property the previous fall and moved north to Kansas with his crew, apparently unable or unwilling to work within the limits of the law and the water rights of his neighbors. And the new owners of the Caldwell property, a family named Brennan, were pleasant and fair, and quickly became the kind of neighbors that West Texas at its best produced. People who helped without being asked and shared without keeping score, and understood that in this landscape, community was not optional. The Brennan family had 4 children, ranging from a girl of 8 to an infant of 6 months, and the two families developed a comfortable habit of Sunday afternoons on one or the other's property, the children occupying the yard, and the adults occupying the shade of whatever tree was available, talking about land and weather and crops and cattle and books, and all the other things that people who have chosen the same difficult, beautiful life find to discuss. James, at 8 months old, watched the Brennan children with the intense, focused attention he brought to everything, and Clara watched him watch them with a small, private smile that Colt noticed and filed away carefully, as one of the images of this life he wanted to remember with his entire mind. The sunflowers along the fence line had come up for the second summer and were tall now, 7 feet in places, their great dark-centered faces turned toward the same sky Clara had pointed out to him on the day he chose the ring. In August, when they were fully out, they made a wall of gold along the fence and drew every bee for half a mile, and filled the evenings with a low, warm sound that was part of summer and part of the 112 acres, and part of everything that made the South Bench a good place to sit at the end of a day. "I want to write something about the sunflowers," Clara said one evening in August, her composition book on her knee. "Write it," he said. "I have been trying to get it right for 2 summers," she said. "What is stopping you?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the flowers in the last light. "I think the problem," she said slowly, "is that the thing I am actually trying to say is not about the sunflowers at all. The sunflowers are just the means by which I arrived at the thing I am trying to say." "What is the thing you are trying to say?" he asked. She looked at him. The evening light was doing something gold and specific to her face, and James was asleep inside, and Alina was reading by the lamp, and the whole world appeared to have contracted to this exact bench, and this exact person and this exact moment. "That I came here with a trunk and an empty composition book, and enough money for 3 months, and the intention to begin again from nothing," she said. "And that I did not know what beginning again could mean, how much more than I expected it could hold." He looked at her for a long time without speaking. "Write that," he said finally. "That is exactly the thing." She looked down at the composition book and then back at the sunflowers, and then she began to write, and he sat beside her in the quiet while she did. In the autumn of 1880, a thing happened that was small in the way that transformative things often are. Denny Sparks rode over on a Sunday afternoon and announced, with a combination of dignity and visible emotion, that he was leaving the Alderman Ranch. He was 61 years old, and his bones had been telling him since last winter that the bunkhouse was no longer a viable living situation. An alderman had offered him a small pension in acknowledgment of his decades of service, which he had accepted with gruff gratitude. His plan, he said, was to find a room to rent in Rehearsing and live quietly and bother nobody, which was his stated preference, though everyone present understood that what he actually meant was that he was tired and lonely and did not particularly want to be alone. Clara looked at him with the directness she always had and said, "We have a room." Denny looked at her, then at Colt, then back at Clara. "Your mother is already here," he said. "There are 3 rooms," Clara said. "Your mother has one, we have one. James shares ours for now. The 3rd room has been serving as a storage room since Alina arrived." She paused. "It does not need to serve as a storage room." "I am not a charity case," Denny said with dignity. "No," Clara said. "You are a person I would like to have nearby because you are one of the best people I know, and this land is large enough that we could use another pair of hands, and you are offering to pay rent, and I would rather have rent and you than rent and a stranger." Denny looked at Colt with an expression that was asking whether Clara was in fact serious. "She is always serious," Colt said. "You will learn that about her." "I already know that about her," Denny said. "Then you know the answer to whatever you are considering," Colt said. Denny moved in on the 1st of November with very little: a bedroll, a trunk, his good boots, a rifle, and a worn Bible he kept on the bedside shelf and never spoke of, but that Colt sometimes saw him with in the early mornings. He paid $3 a month, which Clara insisted upon not because they needed the money, but because she understood that dignity in these matters was non-negotiable. And he contributed to the household with the practiced capability of a man who had been taking care of himself and others for 4 decades. He fixed fences and mended leather, and helped with the cattle in the way that someone deeply experienced knows how to help, without instruction and without getting in the way. Alina and Denny developed, within a few weeks, a relationship of mutual sharp wit and genuine respect that entertained everyone in the house considerably. They disagreed about almost everything that could be disagreed about, from the correct way to make biscuits to the general reliability of the weather signs, and they disagreed with such energy and good humor that mealtimes became the most lively part of the day. James, who was now old enough to watch adults with a focused critical attention, studied them both with enormous interest. Colt watched the whole household with a feeling he could not entirely name, something wide and warm and made up of gratitude and wonder in about equal measure. By the spring of 1881, the 112 acres had become something real and self-sustaining. Colt had 80 head of cattle and was running them on 2 pastures with the creek providing adequate water. He had built a 2nd outbuilding for equipment storage and had plans for a 3rd. The kitchen garden had expanded under Clara's management to something significantly larger than its original plot, and she was producing enough that she had begun selling the surplus through the Rehearsing dry goods store, an arrangement she had proposed to the proprietor directly, and which he had agreed to because her vegetables were notably better than anything else available, and she charged a fair price. Dr. Pearl's office had grown also, taking on a 2nd physician in late 1880, a young man newly trained named Dr. Harrison Cole, who was earnest and capable and completely overwhelmed by the state of the records until Clara put them in order in his 1st week, at which point he regarded her with what could only be described as reverential respect. Clara maintained her 3 mornings a week with an orderly system now in place that any competent person could maintain, and she took quiet satisfaction in the fact that the office ran like a well-regulated clock. She had also, over the winter months, done something with her composition books that she told Colt about on a February evening when the fire was going and James was asleep and the house was quiet. "I have been writing something," she said, "not just observations, something longer." He looked at her. "A story," he said. "Something like that," she said. "I'm not sure what to call it. It is about a woman who comes to a new place with very little and builds something from the beginning. But it is not entirely made up. A great deal of it is quite real. What will you do with it? He asked. She turned her composition book over in her hands, thinking. There is a newspaper in San Antonio, she said. It prints articles and stories. I wrote to them in December and they wrote back and said they would read anything I sent. He let that settle for a moment. Did they? He said. They did, she said, with a composure that did not quite conceal a pleasure so genuine it was almost shy. Then you should send it, he said. It is not finished yet, she said. When it is, he said, you should send it. She nodded, but she was looking at the composition book with an expression he recognized. The one she had when she was already partly inside a thing, and the conversation was just the surface. In the April of 1881, Clara told him she was expecting again, on a morning that was full of birdsong and green light through the kitchen window, over coffee, in the direct way she had of telling him true things. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "How are you?" he said. "Good," she said. "Really good this time, no queasiness. I feel entirely myself." "James will be nearly 2, he said. "Yes," she said. "Good timing." And she smiled at him with the particular smile she had that was entirely warm and entirely her, and that he had spent 3 years collecting like something irreplaceable. James William Reardon, who was in fact approaching 2 years old, and was doing so with impressive determination, was at that moment in the corner of the kitchen carefully relocating a pile of stones he had brought in from the yard to a position that appeared to satisfy some internal organizing principle. He was a deliberate and focused child who had an opinion about where everything belonged. Eleanor, who was having one of her better mornings, was at the stove making oatmeal and appeared to have heard the news from the silence that followed it, the quality of which apparently said everything. "Another one," she said, without turning, but the warmth in her voice was complete. "Another one," Clara confirmed. Eleanor turned then and looked at them both and said, "Good," with the decisive simplicity of a woman who believes in abundance. Denny Sparks, when told at dinner, looked at the table for a moment and then at James and then at Colt and said, "This household is going to need a bigger table." "Already planned," Colt said. "Good man," Denny said. On a clear, cold morning in December of 1881, a daughter arrived, delivered again by Dr. Pearl, with the steady competence of a man who understood that he was participating in something larger than the purely medical. She was smaller than James had been, and quieter at first, and she looked at the world when she opened her eyes with a dark gaze that seemed immediately and entirely focused. They named her Eleanor Rose, the first name for the grandmother who sat in the kitchen and cried for the first time any of them had ever seen, openly and without apology, and the middle name because Clara had been growing roses along the east wall of the stone house for 2 years, and because the name sounded, she said, like something that would last. Eleanor the elder held Eleanor Rose the younger that first evening with a careful tenderness that made the whole room quiet, and looked at the child's face for a long time, and said nothing. Some things do not need language. Colt stood in the doorway watching this, and felt the same thing he had felt on the landing 3 years earlier when Clara had taken his hands, and said, "I know," the sense of a fullness beyond the capacity of any speech he might have practiced. By the spring of 1882, the ranch was genuinely thriving, 103 head of cattle. The kitchen garden, now substantial enough that neighbors sometimes stopped by just to see what could be coaxed from this hard orange dirt with enough patience and the right amendments. The sunflowers along the fence line, which had seeded themselves now for 4 years and came up every summer taller and more numerous than before. The stone house with its good fireplace and its replastered walls, which had been added to at the north end with a new room framed in wood, so that each person under the roof had space, and there was a proper room for the children that caught the morning light. Clara's writing had been published twice now in the San Antonio paper, shorter pieces, essays about life on the frontier, about the experience of women in West Texas, about the particular quality of the landscape, and what it asked of the people who chose it. The editor had written her a letter saying he would take anything else she wanted to send. She had written back a careful and professional reply that gave no indication of the fact that she had read his letter 5 times and stood very still in the kitchen for a full minute after the last reading. Colt had found her standing like that and asked what had happened, and she had handed him the letter without speaking, which was how he knew it was significant. When Clara was most moved, she became briefly wordless, and he had learned to receive her silences the way she had always received his, as things full of meaning. He read the letter and looked up at her. "You are going to keep writing," he said. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "You are not going to say anything more complicated than that," she said. "No," he said, "that is all of it. You are going to keep writing. Good." She looked at him for a moment, and then the smile came, the real one. "All right," she said. On a May evening in 1882, Colt and Clara sat on the south bench in the warm after-supper quiet, and the stone house behind them had lamp light in the windows, and the sounds of Alina and Denny, engaged in what appeared to be a dispute about the proper technique for teaching a child to play checkers, which was an argument conducted entirely for the benefit of James, who was listening with great seriousness, and Alina Rose, who was at the sound-making stage and was contributing to the discussion enthusiastically and incoherently. The creek was running well. The cattle were settled in the south pasture. The first of the season's sunflowers were just beginning to open along the fence, leaning into the evening light with their faces. Clara was writing in her composition book, and Colt was mending a bridle, and neither of them was talking because nothing needed saying right at that moment, and they had long since become two people who could exist inside the same silence and feel together in it rather than apart. After a while Colt put down the bridle and looked at the sunflowers, and then at the woman beside him, the way the evening light moved over her face, the ink stain that was, as it always seemed to be, on her left wrist, the gold ring with the turquoise stone catching the last of the sun. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "I am going to try to say it properly," he said. "The thing I tried to say on the landing that morning. I have had 4 years to practice." She set down her pen. She waited. "You are the most surprising person I have ever known," he said. "You surprised me the first moment I saw you, and you have not stopped. You are the reason I stopped moving and stayed and put down something real and lasting. Everything good that has happened in my life since September of 1877 begins with you." He paused. "That is not quite all of it." "Go on," she said quietly. "I want you to know," he said, "that there is not a single day that I do not feel it what this is, what we have built. I want you to know that I know what this is, and I am not going to forget what it is, and I am not going to take it as something ordinary because it is not ordinary. It is the opposite of ordinary." She was very still, her eyes on him with that open quality he had seen a handful of times, the one where she was not managing anything, not composing or considering, just receiving. "That is the whole speech," he said, 4 years late and still probably not exactly right. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "It is entirely right." "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "Because it is true, and the true things are always exactly right." She picked up his hand from where it rested on his knee and held it, and they sat in the easy quiet of two people who have been saying true things to each other for long enough that the words and the silences have both become fluent, both equally clear. Behind them in the stone house, the argument about checkers had apparently been resolved, because James's voice came through the window in a tone of bright triumph, and Alina Rose made a sound of enthusiastic agreement with whatever had been decided. And then Alina the elder laughed, and Denny said something in his dry, brief way that made everyone laugh again. The sunflowers stood along the fence in the last of the day's light, facing west the way they always did at evening, those great open faces turning toward the going sun. The creek ran clear and cold through the 112 acres that had been nothing but dry possibility 3 years before, and were now something entirely different, something with a name and a shape, and a particular smell in the mornings that anyone who lived there would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The stone fireplace, whose stones had been laid with care by a man long before any of them, held its warmth. The ring was the color of the sky. The spring of 1883 came to the Reardon Ranch with the generosity of a year that had decided to be good, gentle rains in March that left the grass green and the creek running full, and warm days in April that carried the smell of new growth across the open land. The cattle were healthy, and the kitchen garden was already showing its first brave green rose, and the sunflowers were reliably seeding themselves a little further along the fence line each year, as if the 112 acres were slowly being claimed by gold from the outside in. James was 3.5 years old and deeply engaged with the world in a way that required constant and creative supervision. He was the kind of child who had a reason for everything he did, and the reasons were always internally consistent, which meant that when you found him attempting to build a dam in the kitchen drainage ditch with river clay, he could explain the hydraulic logic of the project in more detail than you might have expected from someone not yet 4, and the explanation was, on its own terms, entirely reasonable. He was Clara's child in the structure of his thinking and Colt's child in the physical practicality of his ambitions, and he was wholly himself in the particular quality of his determination. Alina Rose was 14 months old and walking with the decisive and slightly lurching forward lean of someone who has recently discovered locomotion and has not yet found a reasonable relationship with stopping. She had dark eyes and her grandfather's name, which had been Reardon from before anyone in the stone house could remember, and she had a quality of focused attention in those dark eyes that made people feel she was receiving considerably more information from any given moment than she was likely to share. Alina Reardon, whose cough had been managed well through 2 winters now with the doctor's medicine and the warmth of the stone house, and the plain good care of being among people who watched out for her, had one of her good long stretches through the winter and into the spring, well enough to spend afternoons in the kitchen garden with Clara, and to take James for walks to the creek, and to sit with her quilting in the evenings for hours at a time. The quilt she was working on was a large one in blue and gold, and she had told no one what it was for, which meant, Colt suspected, that she had someone specific in mind for it, and he intended to find out eventually. Denny Sparks had turned 63 in February, and had celebrated this fact by declining to acknowledge it and working a full day regardless, after which he had sat at the dinner table and eaten 2 plates of Alina's beef stew, and pronounced himself in good health and no intention of changing his circumstances, which was a speech he gave approximately twice a year as a preemptive declaration against any concern that might be forming in the household's general vicinity. He had, without ever stating it aloud, become the children's favorite person other than their parents. He had an inexhaustible supply of stories, which he calibrated expertly to the age of his audience, and James in particular was developing the habit of arriving at Denny's door in the early mornings and simply standing there until invited in, which Denny invariably did, with grumbling that convinced no one. And then the 2 of them would sit on Denny's bunk and Denny would tell a story about cattle drives or card games or the time he had been to San Francisco and what that had been like. And James would listen with the complete and consuming attention he brought to things that genuinely interested him. In May of 1883, Clara finished the long piece she had been writing in her composition books through the winter. Not quite a story, not quite an essay, something of its own form, about arriving in a place with nothing and building something from the true things. She spent 2 evenings making a clean copy on proper paper and then sent it south to the San Antonio paper with a careful letter. The editor's reply came 6 weeks later and was the most significant thing the post office at Raydrock had received in some time, by Colt's estimation. The piece was accepted. It would be printed in the September edition. The editor wrote that it was the finest thing they had published in 2 years, and asked whether Mrs. Reardon might be interested in contributing regularly. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table while Colt was having his morning coffee, and he watched her face go through several things in quick succession: surprise, which she rarely showed, and then a deep, quiet pleasure, and then the particular expression of someone who has received a thing they have wanted but not quite allowed themselves to expect. She folded the letter and set it down and looked at her coffee cup. "Well," he said, "they want to print it," she said. "I know," he said. "I can read upside down." She looked at him. The expression on her face was still that quiet, overwhelmed one. "You have been writing in those composition books since you were 12 years old," he said. "Yes," she said. "And now someone with good judgment in San Antonio is going to put your words in a paper that people will read," he said. "And you are going to answer that letter and say yes." "Yes," she said. "And you are going to keep writing," he said. "Yes," she said again. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the turquoise ring warm under his palm. "Good," he said. "I told you 4 years ago. That is all of it. Good." She turned her hand over under his and held on, and the morning light came through the south-facing windows and lay in warm blocks across the stone floor. And outside, the kitchen garden was green and full, and the sunflowers were 6 feet tall along the fence. And across the land the creek ran clear through the 112 acres that had become, stone by stone and season by season, the specific and irreplaceable shape of everything they had built together. In September, the San Antonio paper ran Clara's piece, Dr. Pearl obtained a copy and read it twice and came out to the ranch specifically to tell her that it was the finest piece of writing he had encountered in years, and that he was personally very proud, and that she owed him nothing for saying so because it was simply true. Several Raydrock residents told her they had read it. The Brennan wife wrote her a note. A woman in the next town sent a letter to the post office, asking whether the author was the same Mrs. Reardon who lived near Raydrock, Texas, because she had read the piece, and it had described something about her own experience coming to the frontier that she had never seen described in words before, and she was grateful for it. Clara answered every letter. That fall she planted her first fruit trees, 3 apple and 2 pear, along the north side of the property where the soil held moisture. They would not produce for several years, which she knew and said without concern, because she intended to be here when they did, and so did everyone else, and in the meantime they would grow. On a November evening in 1883, the stone house held 6 people and 2 children, and the particular warmth of a place that has become entirely itself over time. The fireplace going, the lamp light on the walls that had been replastered with care, the blue and gold quilt that Alina had finished in October, and which had turned out to be for the children's room, spread over both small beds. James and Alina rose asleep under it with the quilt's careful gold stars above them in the lamplight. Colt and Clara sat on the bench outside in the cold, clear evening with their coats on, and the stars above them, the extraordinary stars of West Texas in winter, more numerous and closer than seems possible, the kind of sky that makes small the idea that human beings are the only thing worth paying attention to in the universe. "Are you happy?" he said. She considered this with her usual care. "Yes," she said, "entirely and specifically. Are you?" "Beyond what I thought possible," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder in the way she had, and they sat for a while not talking, looking at the stars and the dark shapes of the pecan trees along the creek and the fence line where the dead stalks of the summer's sunflowers stood in the moonlight, still as sentinels, waiting for another spring. "I am going to write about this," she said quietly. "The evening," he said. "All of it," she said. "Not just an essay, something longer. Something that starts with a woman getting off a stage in a small town with a trunk and an empty composition book. Then write it," he said. "It will take a while," she said. "We have time," he said. She pressed closer against his side, and above them the winter stars did their ancient, indifferent, and magnificent turning, and below them the land was quiet and theirs and alive in the way that things are alive when they are well tended and genuinely loved. the 112 acres, the stone house with the good fireplace, the kitchen garden sleeping under its winter covering, the pecan trees along the creek, the fence line where the sunflowers would come again in summer, as they always came, turning their great faces toward whatever light was available and filling the whole yard with their enormous simple gold, the ring the color of sky, the proposal that had been practiced for 23 days and delivered in 4 words and a silence that said the rest, the two of them on a bench in the cold dark building still, everything solved, everything rooted, everything at last and fully and without any open question home.